Don't you hate it when you're talking with someone and they're talking about one thing, but you are hearing them talk about something else because you're just not on the same page, and your perception of what they're talking about is completely different from what they're really talking about, and it can create a lot of confusion, a lot of times humorous, but misunderstanding to say the least. Jesus ran into a very serious attitude of misperception among those who were enemies of his, and we read about this in all of his ministry, but in John 2 we find him cleansing the temple, and the reaction from those who were his enemies was quite telling in regard to their animosity toward him, and to some degree even their curiosity. And they ask him in verse 18 of John 2, "What sign do you show to us since you do these things?" In other words, they wanted to know, who are you and can you prove who you are? Well, Jesus goes on to answer them with a very interesting statement. He tells them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will restore it." And Jesus was talking about the temple of his body. And the text goes on to explain that to us, that Jesus wasn't talking about the physical building, that structure that he was in where he had just engaged in this behavior, but he was talking about his body, and he was referring to the resurrection 3 days after his crucifixion. However, the enemies of Jesus heard him say that on one level, but they interpreted it a very different way, because all they heard and understood was the material and the physical. And they responded to him, "This temple has been 46 years as a construction project, and you're going to tear it down and build it back in 3 days?" The Gospel of John is a contrast between the material and the spiritual. And in this particular instance, it's very early in the ministry of Jesus, and yet it sets the tone for the misunderstanding and misperception that many of those who are unspiritually minded would have toward much of the teachings of Jesus. And yet, the last couple of verses related to this particular incident tell us that after the resurrection of Jesus, therefore, when he had risen from the dead, his disciples, these are not his enemies, his disciples remembered what he had said to them, and they believed the scripture and the words which Jesus had said to them. You see, Jesus did this and then followed up on it with his miraculous resurrection, and it created faith in the minds of those who wanted to believe him and who wanted to honestly, objectively examine the evidence. And when we see what Jesus says and that it comes to pass, and we read that in his book and we read that in his teachings, it creates in our hearts and minds faith. So go to the book, learn about Jesus, and build your faith.